Hello everyone. Today we're going to be talking about the Circle of Willis. This is going to be the first video on this channel. Uh, okay, so let's get started. As you can see, Willis here looks like a little spider, and it's actually drawn this way because there are all these arteries that are sort of converging over here. And I know these sound like a lot of scary names, but as we go through them, they're going to sound nicer and easier. And hopefully, they won't seem as daunting by the time you get done with this video. Okay, so let's look at some of the main characters over here. As you can see right over here, this is the posterior aspect of Willis. And you can see that there are two vertebral arteries. So there is one here and there's one here, right? These are two vertebral arteries, and at the anterior aspect of Willis, we can see that there is an internal carotid artery right here, and that gives off this middle cerebral artery, right? And the reason why we're going over this is that Willis has an anterior circulation and a posterior circulation, right? Okay, let's get started with all of the arteries. Before that, we'll have to look at some other stuff that is in Willis, and that is the optic chiasm, which is right over here. Then you have the pituitary gland, which is right here. There is cranial nerve 3, which is also right over here. And besides that, we have the pons, right? So these are just some other stuff that's present with Willis or in Willis. Okay, let's get started. So what exactly is the Circle of Willis? The Circle of Willis is a critical arterial structure located at the base of the brain. It is a circular network of interconnected arteries that provides collateral blood flow to the brain, ensuring adequate perfusion even if one of the main arteries become occluded or narrow. So bear in mind that one of the biggest jobs of the Circle of Willis, and the reason why it is the way that it is to ensure that the brain has a constant supply of blood and oxygen, right? Because the brain doesn't get blood, it goes really bad really fast, right? So anyways, this redundancy in blood supply is vital for maintaining cerebral function and reducing the risk of ischemic damage, and that's the whole idea behind the Circle of Willis. So the anatomy of the Circle of Willis is actually made up by the following arteries. First off, we have the anterior cerebral artery, which is the one right here. It's anterior cerebral artery. Oh, that looks bad. We're just gonna do this, okay? So this is the anterior cerebral artery. There's one more right here. That's two of them. In between the anterior cerebral artery, which you can see right here, is the anterior communicating artery, right? So the anterior cerebral arteries, both of them, they arise from the internal carotid arteries, and they're connected to each other via the anterior communicating artery. And the anterior communicating artery is a short vessel that connects the right and left anterior cerebral arteries, and it completes the interior portion of the circuit. And once again, one of the reasons why it's there is, like I said, the whole point of the circle existing is that these anterior interconnected arteries, they provide a collateral blood flow to the brain. So if in any case if there's any occlusion to the interior cerebral artery, one of it, if even a single one gets occluded, let's say it gets occluded over here, right? So what will happen is that you will have this interior communicating artery right here, and the circulation will move towards here, and so the flow will just happen normally, right? Because the other anterior cerebral artery will take up the place of the occluded one, and this way we'll have the network of circulation still going, and the blood will still continue to flow towards the brain. So this once again ensures adequate perfusion even if one of the main arteries become occluded. After this, we have the after this we have the internal carotid arteries, which are right over here, right? And these are paired arteries that supply blood to the brain. They give rise to the middle cerebral artery and contribute to the Circle of Willis via their connections to posterior communicating arteries. So right here from the internal carotids, both of these, the circle gives rise to the middle cerebral artery, which is right over here, right? And then right after that, we have the posterior communicating arteries, and these arteries connect the internal carotid arteries to the posterior cerebral arteries. So essentially, these posterior communicating arteries, what they do is that they're basically connecting the anterior supply of the Circle of Willis, the anterior supply of the Circle of Willis, with the posterior supply of the Circle of Willis, right? So that's what they're doing, which is why they're really important. They're right here, as you can see, these right there. Okay, and then right after that, we come down to, well, I think we should go down from here. You see this artery right here and this artery right here. These are the vertebral arteries, right? And there are a pair of those. Both of these vertebral arteries sort of join together and they form what we call the basilar artery. So right here, that's the basilar artery, right? And the basilar artery is basically formed by the union of the two vertebral arteries, as I've just said, and it divides into the posterior cerebral artery. So the basilar artery at the end of it gives rise to two posterior cerebral arteries right over here, okay? And in between the posterior cerebral arteries and the posterior communicating arteries, we have cranial nerve 3 right over here, the oculomotor nerve, right? So far we have covered the posterior communicating artery, which is connecting the anterior supply to the posterior supply of the Circle of Willis. Then we have the posterior cerebral artery, which is the splitting off of the basilar artery into the two. You also have the superior cerebral artery. Now bear in mind that this is the posterior cerebral artery and this is the superior cerebellar artery. So the posterior cerebral artery, as the name suggests, supplies to the posterior part of the cerebrum. And then the superior cerebellar artery, as the name suggests, supplies to the cerebellum. And right after that, we also have the anterior inferior cerebellum artery and the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. So a good way to remember all of these arteries, let me get rid of the highlights. A good way to remember these arteries is actually to, where did it go? Okay. A good way to remember these arteries is that we have three cerebral arteries, which is the anterior, middle, and posterior, right? And they're right over here. The anterior cerebral artery, the middle cerebral artery, and then right here we have the posterior cerebral artery, right? All three of these, they are the cerebral arteries, they supply the cerebrum. Then you have the cerebellar arteries, and I know the name sounds a little confusing, the cerebral and the cerebellar. That's why I want you guys to be on the lookout for this. The cerebellar arteries are actually three, and they are the superior cerebellar artery, the anterior inferior cerebellar artery, and the posterior inferior cerebellar artery. So this actually makes the mnemonic SAP, so you could just remember it as that. But let's go over these again. So we have the superior cerebellar artery right here. Then we have the anterior inferior cerebellar artery right here. And then we have the posterior inferior cerebellar artery right here. And these are all the main arteries that you can remember. Let's just bear in mind that we have two vertebral arteries, two of these, and they merge together to form one basilar artery. And then the basilar artery further gives rise to two posterior cerebral arteries. Okay, it's right over here in the diagram, two vertical arteries, and then one basilar artery, and then two posterior cerebral arteries. Okay, there are certain questions that could come in the exam, and they would have to do with the occlusion of the arteries. And one of the questions that could come is that what happens if there is an occlusion right over here? So it's like at the end of the basilar artery where it gives rise to both of these posterior cerebral arteries. Well, what happens is that if there is an occlusion over here, then a person goes completely blind. And the reason for that is the basilar artery actually gives rise to both of the posterior cerebral, and they are actually supplying the visual cortex. So this is something really important to keep in mind. Second of all, we can see, just like the anterior cerebral arteries, the vertebral arteries, if they're ever occluded in any point, the other artery will take care of it. So the other vertebral artery from the other side will take care of it. And so this is how we keep the blood flow going throughout the brain, right? So that's the whole. And the communicating arteries, they function as an anastomosis to ensure that the blood flow is flowing and it's not occluded anywhere. And this is how we keep the brain safe. Yes. And the cerebellar arteries, they supply the corresponding parts of the cerebellum and some parts of the brainstem as well. So this is the entirety of the Circle of Willis, and I hope you like this video. Thank you.